Margaret Rutherford portrayed Miss Marple in 4 feature films in the 1960s. 5 if you count The Unmentionable. The first movie was based on a Miss Marple novel. The next 2 were based on Poirot novels. The last one, Murder Ahoy, was an original story featuring the film-only version of the character, which the filmmakers were mature enough to state clearly right at the beginning. They didn't try to pretend it was another bona fide Miss Marple story, or even an Agatha Christie story. They could have, and probably would have made more money by doing so, but instead they decided to not be jerks. Of course, their decision might have been legally compelled, but even if it was for the wrong reason, it was still the right thing to do. They made it plain that this was their story, not Christie's, even though they were using her character. I wish I could say the same about some of the more recent Miss Marple films. The 12th and last Miss Marple novel Agatha Christie ever wrote was Nemesis, published in 1971. It was adapted 3 times for television, twice in the UK and once in Korea. The 1987 version starring Joan Hickson was not completely faithful to the book, but it still holds up as a decent film and adaptation. The only major changes it made were the invention of a new nephew of Miss Marple's, a certain character not being in prison, and one murder being committed a little differently. This video is going to focus on the 2007 adaptation starring Geraldine McEwen. 2 Marple novels ago, in A Caribbean Mystery, Miss Marple solved a series of murders in collaboration with a rich old man named Jason Raphael. Nemesis begins with Raphael's death by natural causes. He leaves behind a message for Miss Marple, asking her to apply her flair for solving crime to an injustice. Exactly what injustice he doesn't specify. In fact, Nemesis is an unusual mystery in that the first half of the book is all about Miss Marple trying to figure out what the mystery is. Before too long, Miss Marple receives instructions to go on a coach tour. She recognizes one of her fellow passengers, Miss Cook, as someone who was watching her at her house even before she'd received Mr. Raphael's request. Another passenger, Elizabeth Temple, who used to run a girls' school, tells her that she had a pupil, Verity, who was engaged to Jason's son, Michael, before she died. When Miss Marple asks how Verity died, Elizabeth Temple replies,
Love? I don't know. Love, I think.
The next breadcrumb in the trail left by Raphael is an invitation to stay with 3 sisters, Lavinia, Anthea, and Clotilde. Miss Marple senses a strange atmosphere in the sisters' house, which could be attributed to the violent death 10 years ago of Clotilde's ward. To Miss Marple's surprise, the ward was Miss Temple's pupil, Verity. Not only was Verity engaged to Michael Raphael, he was tried and convicted for her murder. He's been in prison ever since. Before Miss Marple can question Miss Temple further, Miss Temple is severely injured in an apparent accident. At this point, one of the other passengers on the tour, Professor Wanstead, approaches Miss Marple and says he was sent here by Jason Raphael. After satisfying herself that Wanstead is an ally, Miss Marple insists he tell her what the hell this is all about. In less colorful language, of course. Wanstead confirms that Raphael's intention, or at least his hope, was for Miss Marple to exonerate his son of the murder for which he was wrongfully convicted, and find Verity's true killer. This covers about half the book, so I'm going to turn to the film and sum up what happens up to this point. The film begins with a flashback. Since all the Marple stories in this series are set in the early 50s, the flashback takes place in 1940. The Raphaels have been made German, so Michael Raphael is now a Nazi, and this is how he and Verity first meet. Then we fast forward to Miss Marple's time, and the film starts following the book, though mercifully it moves along a little faster. I don't know why the series decided to adapt Nemesis before adapting A Caribbean Mystery, where Jason Raphael would have been introduced, but I like how they used the dialogue to encapsulate Miss Marple's relationship with him.
You're not terrifying after all.
Should I be?
Mr. Raphael called you Nemesis.
Just like the Joan Hickson version, the McEwen film provides Miss Marple with an assistant in the form of a nephew, though instead of inventing one, they give us Raymond West, played by Richard E. Grant. Raymond appeared in the first Miss Marple story, The Tuesday Night Club, along with his wife-to-be, Joyce Lempriere, whose name, assuming it's the same person, later changes to Joan. He's a successful mystery novelist, though according to Miss Marple, his understanding of human nature is sadly deficient, but she's still fond of him. That fondness extends to the film series, even though Raymond has been made into a bit of a Lothario, with multiple girlfriends and an aversion to deadlines. His affection for his aunt is reflected in turn.
I could do with a holiday. Avril and Sophia can wait.
In the book, the coach tour is called Historic Homes and Gardens. In the film, it's called Daffodil Tours, which is interesting. A character in the Marple novel Sleeping Murder owned a company by that name, but when the McEwan series adapted that story, Daffodil Tours was left out. The tour guide is Miss Barrow, who, in the novel, along with Miss Cook, is one of the women who seem to be stalking Miss Marple. There are 10 other passengers who are pretty much film only, except for 2, one of whom I'm not going to name just yet, and Michael, using an alias. It's gradually made plain that all of the passengers are connected to the main story, and all were assembled, in one way or another, by Jason Raphael. Sadly, none of them receives much development, as there's so much exposition they're required to divulge that they don't have any screen time left for meaningful interaction. On top of that, not one, but 2 of the passengers are murdered. First, Mr. Rayburn, a former butler, and Mrs. Waddy, who dies in a manner similar to Elizabeth Temple. It transpires that Verity was a nun at the time that Michael Raphael was shot down, and she nursed him back to health. She was not found murdered. Rather, she was last seen going to tell Michael she would not be leaving the convent to marry him, and then she disappeared without a trace. The Mother Superior believes that Michael killed her. It seems like the reason the screenwriter made the Raphaels German, and Michael a Nazi, was so that the nuns would have a reason not to report Verity's conspicuous disappearance, because to implicate Michael, they'd have to admit that they were illegally treating enemy soldiers. This, in turn, enabled the writer to keep Michael out of prison and place him on the bus, providing a greater potential for drama. Except him being in prison was the main reason his father knew about the murder and set this whole thing in motion. Without Michael having been wrongly convicted and facing life imprisonment, would Raphael really endanger Miss Marple and all these other people? Of course, the Hickson adaptation also keeps Michael out of prison, but in that film it works because of another change they made.
Mr. Raphael wanted justice for the dead girl, even if it meant the sacrifice of his son. I flatter myself that's why he chose me, even if it meant sending Michael to the gallows.
I thought that put an interesting spin on it. Returning to the book, on her deathbed, Miss Temple asks for Miss Marple. Just before dying, Miss Temple whispers, "Which of them?" Miss Marple learns Miss Temple had been on her way to meet Archdeacon Brabazon, which I'm probably mispronouncing, to discuss Verity's murder. The Archdeacon would have been the one to officiate the wedding between Michael and Verity, had it taken place. Miss Temple was killed to prevent the 2 of them from figuring out what really happened. Her last words refer either to someone on the coach tour or one of the 3 sisters. Investigating further, Miss Marple finds out Verity was one of several teenage girls murdered around that time, though most of the others were killed hundreds of miles away. The only other victim who lived nearby was a girl named Nora Broad, whose body was actually never found. In fact, Verity's body wasn't found either until a month after she disappeared. Her face was so battered, Clotilde had to go identify her. Miss Marple discovers one other thing Nora and Verity had in common. They were both pregnant when they were killed. Finally, Miss Marple puts it all together. When Elizabeth Temple had said, "love," she meant that Verity was killed by someone who loved her. But no one who loved Verity would have disfigured her face. The body that had been found was not Verity's, but Nora's, another pregnant teen of the same age. This points the finger at Clotilde, who had identified the body. She killed Nora and used her to implicate Michael, out of revenge for trying to take Verity away from her. She'd loved Verity so much she'd rather have her dead and buried in the garden than let her escape into adulthood. Miss Marple tricks Clotilde into revealing herself as the murderer. When Clotilde prepares to do away with her, the 2 stalkers, Miss Cook and Miss Barrow, suddenly pop out of their hiding places. Mr. Raphael had hired them as bodyguards for Miss Marple. They'd been protecting her this whole time. Realizing the game is up, Clotilde commits suicide. Michael is released from prison, and our last ever image of Miss Marple is an old woman laughing, and in so doing, giving the impression of a young woman. Well, by now it's clear that the film version of Nemesis is not at all the same story, although when I saw it, I enjoyed it at first. It reminded me of The Siddiford Mystery, another Marple pseudo-adaptation. New suspects, new motives, new themes, but still creative and entertaining enough for me to not complain about it bearing a Christie title. The Nemesis film starts out fun and energetic. And then it jumps the shark. Nemesis was the Greek goddess of retribution. When Jason Raphael first gave Miss Marple that nickname, he might have meant it jokingly. The whole point of this story is that it's no joke at all, and it couldn't be made plainer than by the powerful scene when Miss Marple confronts the murderer, alone, something she does very rarely. You can feel how much she embodies Nemesis, whereas in the film, when she enlists the help of practically all the other suspects, she has to state out loud that she's Nemesis in order to get the point across. It's played like a powerful scene, but it packs very little punch. One character is a young woman who bears a resemblance to Verity. At the end, she dresses up as a nun to make Clotilde think she's seeing Verity's ghost and elicit a confession. In the book, it's implied that Clotilde has been tortured by visions of Verity, but at no time in the film has that been established, and without our knowing it, this plot device just seems contrived and weak. Instead of a garden, Verity is buried in place of an unknown soldier, and no decoy body is required. Well, that's simpler, if less interesting, than the whole Nora Broad thing. But then the nuns found out the soldier's name, and they put it on the grave, and the real soldier didn't die, but he had amnesia, and his face was all messed up. So Clotilde managed to convince both him and this lady that he was her long-lost husband, which is why this lady had to die, because she would have recognized Clotilde as whoever. At this point, my head's spinning too much to care. The main point about Clotilde is that she loved Verity to the point of possessiveness, loved her too much to make her death a violent one. The murder method in the book was a painless overdose, a gentle killing, which makes it all the more unsettling. For the film, Clotilde commits the murder by taking a convenient spear from a statue and... Also, they took Clotilde's possessive love and gave it sexual undertones, the same as they did with the murderer in another Miss Marple story, which we'll talk about a couple videos from now. Do the writers not know how to portray love that isn't sexual? Did they think that the way Book Clotilde loved Verity wasn't scandalous enough or dramatic? For what it's worth, this writer doesn't think so. Oh, and remember how the film twisted the story out of shape just so Michael could be present? In the end, during the climax and the epilogue, he stands there. That's what he was brought here to do. Stand there. Which is more than can be said for Raymond, who has barely contributed to the story. Well, then again, it's Richard E. Grant. I guess that can be forgiven. To be fair, this is not one of those adaptations that makes me want to throw things at the screen. More like, I want to hide behind a pillow and hope that none of the people I want to convert into Christie fans ever sees this film. The more movies the Marple series did, the farther and farther they went off the deep end. For the most part. The biggest perpetrators were all stories where Miss Marple was added in. The Secret of Chimneys, Murder is Easy, and Why Didn't They Ask Evans? I know I've had requests to cover those, but trust me, you would get tired of me really fast, as the only thing I could say over and over is that these movies are bonkers, and there are much better choices out there. You know, at least with the Poirot series, they never had this problem. Those screenwriters knew better than to go bananas with shit.